So today we have Guy Wallace with us. Guy is a performance analyst and instructional architect. He has been an external consultant since 1982, that's about 40 years, and has conducted over 250 projects for over 80 clients, including over 45 Fortune 500 companies. Guy is particularly known for his consulting work, writings, and presentations on both performance analysis and curriculum architecture design. He's conducted 76 curriculum architecture and design efforts as a consultant since his first in 1982. Guy, welcome to the L&D Go Beyond podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. And I have to tell you, I have followed you on LinkedIn for more than a year, and I really appreciate your generous shares on almost anything related to learning and performance. I have to first thank you for all of that. It's been great learning from you, and I'm really honored to have you on the podcast today.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be here. And by the way, congratulations on bagging 14 awards from Brandon Hall. That's a pretty significant accomplishment.
It is. Thank you so much. Thank you. It means a lot. Thank you. All right. So, Guy, to get started, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? We read about you, of course, from your bio, but what's been your journey like? And, what gets you excited today after 40 years?
Well, my journey goes way back to 1979. I got a radio, TV, film degree, and the company that I was working for when I went to while I was going to college offered me a job, and I moved from Lawrence, Kansas to Saginaw, Michigan, and joined the training organization at the headquarters of Wix Lumber. Mm-hmm. And I joined a brand new department. There was 10 people in this training function, and there was already a guy there, so I became Guy too, which is funny. But the two people that I went to work with were the program development organization within the training function. And the training function was converting from 35 millimeter slides and an audio strip as their means of deploying content to video. And so I was brought in to help with video, but they didn't put me in the video department. They put me in the program development organization because I was the only one with field experience. And the two people that I went to work for had recently arrived there just a month before me, and they came from Blue Cross Blue Shield in Detroit, Michigan, where they worked with the brother of Gary Rumler, a guy named Rick Rumler. And Gary Rumler was a partner with Tom Gilbert, and they had an organization called Praxis that just folded just before I got out of college. But anyway, I learned the methodologies for doing a performance analysis. And I was told at the time, back in August of 1979, that was a derivative of the Rumler approach to performance analysis. And so that was kind of my roots. So I was initially oriented to this thing, a performance orientation, because performance is what we in the training or learning or instruction business are trying to affect. We're trying to prepare people to go back out on the jobs and perform. And so that orientation was really critical in my development. And after almost 2 years at Wix Lumber, I went to Motorola and their corporate training at the headquarters in Schaumburg, Illinois. And one of the consultants working with that organization was Gary Rumler. And so I got a chance to work with Gary Rumler for about 18 months on a dozen or so projects. And he was my consultant, which meant I carried his pencils around as we went from client site to client site and project to project. That was the joke back then. Because he was obviously a guru in terms of instruction, and in particular, what he called performance-based training. And so that's my orientation. My approaches and models and methods are slightly different than his, but it all has that root of looking at performance.
Fantastic. I'm sure that would have given you very solid grounding, and that's why we see a lot of performance focus in whatever you say and do. And in fact, that's one of the things that we're going to focus our discussion today on, performance focus in training. But just a quick, follow-on question. What excites you today, having spent 40 years in this?
Well, what excites me is the opportunity to shift our orientation, which has been true since I got into the business, from topics to tasks and the outputs that they produce and the stakeholder requirements. So this is something that's kind of come and raised its head, so to speak, and became a thing several times in the past 40 years. But too often our organizations that focus on learning, focus on topics with face validity, but they don't often enough address how to apply those topics in people's task performance. And tasks are something that, is best looked at in terms of what are the outputs produced. That's one of the things I learned from Rumler is, what's produced, what's the output that's produced. And so I'm excited that there's lots of people now beginning to talk about that across the industry, across the planet, actually. And so that's a kind of exciting that hopefully that this time for sure, I think is my hope.
I really hope so that happens. But just to put that in perspective, what you're saying is, we've seen a lot of L&D organizations. There is a lot of focus on training, but even learning may not be the real focus sometimes. And then performance is probably even farther away. So what you are suggesting is if there was a chain between training, learning, and performance, you are essentially focusing on the end outcome, as you said, output products of tasks that people are performing.
Yes. And so the language that is part of our field, our profession, is very, very messy. So what was once called instruction was later called training. And then because of Peter Senge's book, The Fifth Discipline in 1990, many of my clients started changing their names of their organizations from the training function to the learning function, as if they were the learning organization, which is one of the things he spoke about in that book. But that's when there was a major shift to the learner and but the focus of performance-based training was always on the learner and their performance requirements. And so there's a lot of confusion in our field, in the marketplace, sometimes generated by ourselves, sometimes generated by the vendors who support our organization as they try to, claim that what they're doing is new and different. We can't get hung up in a lot of the labels. We've got to look beyond the labels to see, what's going on, what are the activities, what are the results of those activities, as we make judgments about, different approaches and things in this field.
True. And, we may have already started covering the topic of discussion today, but let me, put the first question to you on, what do you mean by this performance focus in training? Maybe you covered a little bit already, but if you want to clarify that a little more.
Well, thank you. So my definition is about performance competence. And I borrowed the word competence from the late Tom Gilbert's book, Human Competence, which came out in 1978, just before, but it was one of the first things I was given my first day on the job was that book and something from Rumler and Gilbert, and then a thing from Bob Mager. So those were my major influences. But so I define performance competence as the ability to perform tasks, to produce outputs, to stakeholder requirements. And this is applicable to the individual, to the team, to the processes, to the department, to the functions, to the enterprise, and to the value chain. It's all about performing tasks to produce outputs, and they must meet stakeholder requirements. So the output has various stakeholders and they have requirements. The process, the tasks themselves have stakeholders and they have requirements. So part of this performance orientation is understanding all of that. And it's not necessarily simple. It can be quite complex. There could be varied sets of tasks that will produce an output depending on the conditions that one is facing. So, it behooves us in the instructional design, learning experience design business to have an approach to gaining that performance perspective so that we can help enable the people that have to perform within that. Those are our learners who are really performers back on the job. And so that approach, I think, is really, critical to having, transfer back to the job and positive impact, return on the investment that our clients are making in instruction, in learning. And they want to see some sort of improvement happen or sustaining existing performance so that it doesn't degrade over time.
So, to me, of course, this is something that most L&D professionals should be ideally looking at and considering, but clearly it is not happening, right? So why is this performance orientation in general missing? What have you found? Because you've been, again, doing this for so long. And do you see the same challenges persist, which were there maybe 2 decades, 3 decades ago, or the challenges are different now?
I think the challenges are pretty much the same. The only thing that's changed in the last 40 years is the technology, the computerized technology, digital technology that enables us to do our work, and it enables us to deploy or make accessible our work. But the issues go back to, I think there's 3 sources for the issues. There's our clients themselves, there's our own L&D leadership, and there's the L&D practitioners. But our clients don't seem to value, and sometimes that's our own fault, they don't value doing an analysis or a discovery on the front end of creating instructional content. They've not seen a lot of value in that. Back in 1981, when I was an employee at Motorola, my clients, I had 30 manufacturing managers in a room, and they were giving me a request for training. And they gave me their request. And I did my best active listening, repeating what I was hearing so that they know that I heard them. And then I said, okay, so this is how I think we need to approach doing the analysis. And the head guy stopped me and he said, Guy, we hate it when people like you come back 90 days later to tell us what we told you on day 1. And immediately I recognized that, okay, so they had a bad experience with analysis from my predecessors, whoever had come before me and done work for them. And they didn't see any value in it. They didn't see anything new and different that said that was worthwhile effort over 90 days. So I immediately went into a mode of conducting my analysis with them, 30 operational managers, high-level people at Motorola. This was about their request was for supervisors in the manufacturing environments, and most all of them had been supervisors maybe 15 or 20 years earlier. So they didn't understand the current day situation. So I asked them my questions about the outputs and the tasks, and who's involved in the task performance. When are you doing things all by yourself, and when are you collaborating with others, and what were some of the issues in task performance and producing the outputs. And I soon exhausted their knowledge. They realized that these were good questions that Guy was asking, but they didn't know for sure. Or they got into arguments with each other about, the reality of it. And I said, so you have these meetings every 30 days. And so I'll come back in 30 days and do a readout of my analysis that this is what I'm going to need to do. And I'm going to need your help lining up the right people for me to talk to, the best supervisors you've got. Maybe they're no longer supervisors, but were recently, and getting some guidance from them about what is the job that we want to prepare people to do, what are the difficulties in all of that, and what do you got to know to be able to do that. And I guess that's I sold them on doing that, and then I came back 30 days later and did a readout to them, and so it worked. But so our clients are one of the problems, but another problem that I've seen, because I've had 80 some clients over the past 40 years, and a lot of L&D leadership and the training and development leadership before them, they haven't sold their clients, the stakeholders for the organization that they run. They've not sold them on the need for analysis and what that's all about. And they've not put in a philosophy or processes or practices and the infrastructure required for their people to conduct this kind of analysis. So there's a huge issue there. And then the L&D practitioners themselves are, this is not their fault usually. Sometimes they don't know how to do analysis, but that's a management issue too, I think. But they're not given the opportunity to do this. They're told to start developing. Here's some content and just create some instructions. So there's no project planning, there's no analysis that's done, there's no real design that's done. And then there's just development. So we just jump in and start doing development without having the predecessor activities done so that will lead to success. And then our organizations don't measure results. We measure activities. We measure learning activities and report out learning activities, and we never really get to measuring the results. And that's a function of us not knowing what results we were going for in the first place because we didn't do analysis. So, but this is an age-old problem. Here I am whining and crying about this here after 40 years in the business. Back in the early 80s, the gurus that I paid attention to, they were whining and crying about this. So this is not a new phenomenon. This is just how it is. And so, but I've had some clients and I've worked for some organizations where they really push this performance orientation and conducting a proper analysis and doing it quickly, because analysis paralysis is no good. And that's one of the faults, I think, of the processes that are not in place or practitioners who don't really know what they're doing. They think they have to gather everything in order to conduct this analysis before they go into design, rather than spreading analysis out from project planning into analysis, into design, into development. They try to get it all once. And there's a phrase from the total quality management movement that I learned in 1981, and that's, we don't need to boil the ocean for a cup of tea. Too often, our analysis practices are the equivalent of boiling the ocean. We try to gather every piece of data that we might possibly use. And then from my experience, most of that data is never, ever used. So why do we gather it in the first place? And so one of the things that I learned in my approach to instructional analysis is to do just enough right now for what I need in the moment and for my next steps, and defer the rest of it to later. So I'm doing analysis when I do project planning, and I do the intake process, and I do project planning, and I review the project plan and identify the key resources. I'm doing analysis there. And when I'm doing my analysis efforts in my projects, I'm looking at target audience analysis. Who are they? Where are they coming from? What's their background, education, and experience? What can I safely assume that they already know and maybe don't know? And then a performance analysis. So what are the outputs? What are the tasks? And then I do a knowledge and a gap analysis. And then I do a knowledge and skill analysis. What are the enabling knowledge and skills that allow, that people need to know in order to be able to do that performance? And my fourth type of analysis is always assessing the existing content that my clients have. So to see if I can reuse it as is or after modification. And that's why I have some insight into, what kind of instruction, training, learning has been produced in my client organizations. And what I found generally is that a lot of content on topics that have face validity and could have performance validity if only they would have included in that content how to apply that in somebody's real world context. But too often are the topics, something like active listening is addressed, and we can't get too specific about examples or the practice and feedback exercises we put people through, because then it wouldn't be applicable to everybody. And so too often, I think our leaders and our clients want content that is applicable to everybody, which means it can't get specific. It has to be very general. And that general kind of content does not transfer back to the job because we've not prepared people for their job and applying whatever the content was. And so they struggle with that, and then they give up and they revert back to how they always did it. So it was a total wasted effort. And because it doesn't transfer, we can't have a positive impact on the performance. We can't get better, faster, cheaper outputs and task performance because we didn't know what that was in the first place, because we were dealing with a topic and we didn't know exactly how our target audiences were to apply that in their real world work. I think those are our challenges, is overcoming all of that. And it's not something that's necessarily easy to do. Otherwise, we would have done it a long time ago.
Sure. So there's a lot in there, to unpack, and of course, I'll come back to some of those. I think you said about maybe 4 types of analysis that you get to do, and the focus on generic content itself could be a challenge. But, when you began with this, analysis is probably the biggest problem area or a challenge. And that itself could be coming from, and this is, my thought, the brand that L&D has created for itself over the years, because it does not deliver so much, like you said, we don't measure the right things. The management or the stakeholders are not really interested in investing so much, and they say, just get it done, So it's kind of a, self-defeating loop, call it downward spiral, whatever you want to, but, something like that, where you're not delivering, brand is suffering, less, investment, etc. And then you're going down that spiral continuously.
True. I mean, that's what can happen. And so, how do you break that spiral? How do you gently push back to your clients, to your stakeholders? How do you help them begin to see how this could be different, how we could focus on people's actual job performance, how we can tie to the business metrics that they probably already have in place or could have in place? One of the things I've said to clients in the past is that, if you don't have business metrics measuring what it is you want us to address, how important is it anyway? Perhaps this should be left to informal learning and social learning means, and you shouldn't try to formalize it, because the business itself that you're trying to support isn't even measuring this. Now, we can affect things that are aspects of a business metric, but we can't address everything, because there's marketplace conditions and the general economy and things like that that affect some of these business metrics. But we can do our part to help people perform more effectively, more efficiently, having higher quality, reducing costs and things like that. And so, because we've not talked with our clients on the front end when they ask projects, and we don't understand what business metrics are we trying to affect, and how will we know if we're successful? Which metrics? How long might that take? If we deliver some instruction, some learning, and people go back to the job, are we expecting the numbers to change that day, or will it take a while? So what is the expectation that we all have? And by the way, what are the baselines for those measures anyway? What are they today? What have they been? Are we trending down because of the general economy? And so we're trying to slow that down. We're not going to necessarily reverse it, but we're going to slow down some downward trend. So those are conversations that we need to have with our stakeholders, with our clients. And that takes a business perspective. That takes a little bit of understanding business metrics, and in particular, financial metrics. How do we keep score in the organization? What are those metrics, and which ones might we be trying to affect here? And that's having a business conversation before we start talking about instruction or learning. So I think it's important to be a business champion first, a learning champion second, and a business champion third, and surround our instructional learning perspectives and enthusiasm with a business orientation, because that's what we're trying to do. We're not in the business of creating learning for the sake of learning. We really want it to have a business impact. Now, there are exceptions to that, of course, and I'm maybe overgeneralizing, but in truth, our clients want results. They want improved results, and maybe they don't understand what training and instruction could be and should be, and we have to help them begin to see that. And I've been in plenty of situations where I've dealt with skeptical clients, and I give them my pitch and tell them how I'm going to do that and how we might affect that. And they're skeptical. And so I invite them into the process. My processes are very customer-oriented, stakeholder-oriented. And I do a lot of team-based, group-based analysis and instructional design and development, and then pilot testing. And I invite my clients to participate in that as I refer to it, management spies. Yes, you're not a master performer. You don't do the job at a level of mastery before we started using you and tapping into you and get your wisdom and package that. But why don't you come along on our journey and see what's going on? And then you can make judgments about whether we're doing good stuff or garbage. And the skeptical people will always sign up for that because they're going to want to watch this and bird dog it, if you will, and watch really closely to see if this makes sense. And I'm happy when they go back to our formal client meetings and report back that this is great. This is different. And so then I can turn them around and then get their support and I need their support throughout the project, but then when we're ready to release our instructional content, our learning, and we need the management organizations to receive this instruction and put their people through it and reinforce and support it, I need their support. And if my clients and stakeholders are the right people in the organization, they can make that happen. They can set expectations for the field, if you will, and say, all right, we're expecting this to get implemented. We're expecting to see these changes. Your job as managers of the target audience is to do this and do this and do this. And I'm going to be watching and measuring you because otherwise we won't train. My clients have often said to me, you hounded us about transfer from day one. Before we'd actually done any analysis, design, or development content, you're talking about transfer. And I would say, yeah, because it's always an issue. I've been a part of projects where we produced great stuff and then it faltered once it was released because the clients weren't interested in stimulating the requirements for using this. They just thought, oh, we've got it. We'll just put it out there and see what happens. And then nothing happened because the people out in the field were busy, focused on other things, and they didn't see this as a way to necessarily leverage their own employees. And so I've learned to bring up the issue of transfer. What could the barriers possibly be? Are we expecting people to change behavior? Well, we know how that goes. They're not going to necessarily want to change their behaviors because they feel they've got a handle on how to do it now. And we're asking them to do it in a different way, which means the performers have to do it in a different way. Managers have to manage something that's different, that's new and unique, and they may not know how to do that or feel comfortable doing that. So the managers themselves might stop changes from happening. And so, I would challenge my clients and say, so what are you going to do about it? I'm going to produce the instruction. What are you going to do about the fact that they're not going to be receptive to it, or they're going to begrudgingly put their people through it and then expect them to not change at all and do it the old way, something that they're comfortable with? And that usually leads to a conversation with my client groups about, gee, he's probably right. What are we going to do about it? And I said, well, you don't have to decide right now. I just want it on your radar screen, because as we go through this project, we're going to learn a little bit more and more about what are the issues that we might be facing in terms of getting this transfer to happen, because we want that positive impact. And so we can have a strategy and set of tactics that will help go along in parallel with the release of this content, where we either deploy it or we make it accessible.
Yeah. So, now I'm trying to combine your two responses. And because I heard about analysis, which is, of course, the cornerstone of the strategy, there is an involvement of management people during the process and taking them on a journey, which probably is an equally important part, because we can keep doing our stuff, but if they're not buying into it and not part of it and can't appreciate it, it will eventually fall off. And also focusing on the transfer part, which puts a little bit of responsibility on the managers, which, I think we have now realized that without managers or line managers support, none of it is going to really work in actual life. But is this, a good process for somebody to work with, or there are more elements to it? So I've just listed 3 that I could capture, but maybe there is more. If you were to tell somebody, people who are in the learning L&D domain, not even leaders, but people who are designing, creating stuff. And if they were to think, I have to develop performance focus, I heard these three things, but is there a process that they can, possibly adopt or something?
Well, I think that there are many. I have my own, and I've written extensively about this, and so a lot of that is accessible, and people can, adopt what they can and adapt the rest. But there's other processes. Bob Mager had a process, Joe Harless, Gary Rumler, and many, many, many others. And it's unfair to try to list just a few of them. But so that this is not a secret. That stuff's been out for decades. But I would push back a little bit that it's not the practitioner. We can't expect practitioners to be supermen and superwomen and fend off their leadership's lack of preparation. It's really the late quality guru W. Edwards Deming said that 94% of problems are due to the system, and management is in control of the system. You can't blame individual performers in a factory setting or anywhere for problems because it's really management. And management needs to step up to this. And so managers need to help the clients and stakeholders understand a better route to learning and to impact performance. And leaders in L&D need to put in the philosophies and live them and put in the processes, good, sound, performance-based instructional set of processes, and put in the practices that are best. This is not got to be rigorous. This should be somewhat flexible, but there's got to be this core belief that performance is what we're trying to do. So let's really focus on that and figure out how to enable performance for our learners. And we need to provide the tools and techniques and the training for our own staff to be able to do these kinds of things. So I'm uncomfortable when we think of, what can the learning and development professional do? Well, they can try and fight the system, but then they're going to eventually have to give up and just comply with what the system allows or demands. And so really this is a leadership issue for me, and leaders need to, provide their people with good practices, good processes for conducting analysis. They need to put that into the project plans that they sell their clients. They need to have a way to do this quickly so that it's not analysis paralysis. And so, but so I think one of the key things for me is at the beginning of a project, I've been a consultant since 1982. So when I get brought in, it's usually for something that's really high stakes performance, which to me is high risk or high reward. Sometimes they're the flip side of the same coin. But so I asked my client, the person making the request to me, to assemble a project steering team. You can call it whatever you want, but I call it a project steering team, unless they have a different name for it. And these are all the stakeholders. So if I'm dealing with sales, I want all the sales vice presidents on this project steering team because they are the stakeholders. If we do good stuff for their salespeople, they win. Their numbers are going to go up and be much better. They're going to get better bonuses, yada, yada. And if it's a manufacturing people, the same thing. I want the stakeholders because I'm going to need them to identify who are the master performers, the top performers that we want everybody else to be more like them, perform more at their kind of level. So master performers have strategies and tactics on how to perform, how to avoid problems in the first place, and how to recover in the second place should the problems be unavoidable. So, it's more than us just teaching people ABC, 1, 2, 3. It's all very simple. No, most high stakes performance is fraught with barriers to successful performance. And so what do the master performers know about those things? And can we tap into those and share those with our learners? Maybe not immediately, but maybe, in the second wave or third wave of their learning, they learn how to deal with more complex and more difficult situations, which is what the performance context may hold for them. So in order to get the right people involved in my projects for my group process, I need to assemble a project steering team. And I'll tell you the truth. The projects that I have been involved in that failed miserably were because my clients didn't want to share decision-making with a project steering team of their peers or people at a higher level than them. We don't want to bother them. And so we went alone, and I was given people to work with that I wasn't always sure that they were the top best performers. They were simply people who were made available to me. And that didn't give me a great confidence in this. But if I don't do the job for a living, how would I know if they were competent or not? I mean, I'm just taking their word for it. So I like to call the people that I want to work with master performers. There are other subject matter experts, but I don't like subject matter experts because subject matter experts don't necessarily perform the job that I'm trying to train on to a level of mastery. They may know a lot about it, but it's like knowing a lot about welding, but never knowing how to actually do welding, but you know a lot about it. Well, that's not good enough. I want people who actually know how to weld or sell. And so I want to get the best people. So I need that project steering team to decide that, yeah, they want to invest for the best possible return. And they want to give me their top performers so that I can facilitate those top performers in conducting the analysis. So what are the outputs? How are they really measured? And I've had master performers tell me, well, the company measures it this way, but the real world measures it that way, guys. So we totally ignore the company's measures and we focus on these because that's the only way we're going to be successful, which is eye-opening to my clients when they hear about this later on. But the master performers know that's how they became master performers. They figured it all out, and no one gave them the guidance. They had to figure this out on their own informally and socially. And so then what are the tasks and what are the difficulties and what are the things that you watch out for to make sure that, your approach is going to work, or do you have to change and vary it a little bit because of situational things? And so what are those situational things that our learners need to be prepared to watch out for and be able to respond in a slightly different manner should that situational variable be present? And so, so I need master performers to do that. Now, my master performers may not know the regulations inside and out, and so maybe I need an other subject matter expert from regulatory affairs, or I need somebody from the law department who understands contract law or whatever the issue is. So I may need other people other than master performers to do the analysis to really get it down and understand it. And then I want to use that same group of people to do the design. So I have a group process, a facilitated group process for doing analysis and one for doing design. And where it's not designing by committee, but it's influencing the designer by committee. And I'm the designer. And so I want these people. So when I say, hey, how about if we do this? They can say, oh, no, that's stupid. Here's why. We'll go, how about this then? Or what do you suggest? And we collaborate to create a design of instruction that focuses on, I like to default to job aids or, performance support. And so my first inclination when I'm doing design is I say, why don't we create a series of job aids and then give them to performers and then they can do that. And some of these job aids may help provide guidance for trickier, dangerous, or really high stakes performance. And maybe we need to train them on the use of the job aid in training or learning or instruction. And either that makes sense to these master performers or it doesn't. And that I let them make the decisions. I simply am there to facilitate them and they get to make all the key critical decisions. I can warn them about, well, that's a bad practice for learning's sake. We can have them hear about it and see it, but then if they don't practice it, they're not going to learn it and they're not going to be able to take it back to the job. And we can argue about that. But if they decide, no practice exercises, I'll say, okay, you win, but I'm going back to the project steering team and telling them you were wrong. And I'm going to ask them to put that back in there. So maybe you want to show up to that meeting too. And that's happened. Because I want the client, the stakeholders, they have the stakes and they know that, hey, we want people to perform. And if they're not going to practice, something I learned from Neil Rackham was he asked my clients at Motorola, do you guys play golf or tennis? And they all went, yeah, we all do. He goes, have you ever had a lesson from a coach? Oh, yeah, they all had. He said, did they ever change your grip? And they said, oh, yeah. And he goes, what happened to ball control? And they would say, oh, the ball went this way. And it was terrible. And he said, I bet you then reverted back to the way you used to grip the club. And they all said, yeah. And he goes, well, that's the job of training and a coach is to get you to use the proper grip so that your performance will eventually be great, better. But when you first use a new grip, you don't have ball control. So the first thing everybody does is revert. So we need coaches, instructors to keep people in the practice and feedback sessions to use the right grip. And when we use, then we shift into transfer. And then when they go out to the job, we need the managers to say, hey, Guy, use the proper grip. You reverted back to your old grip or the equivalent of that. And so that's the kinds of things that, we need to help our learners master the new grip, so to speak, and so they can go back to the job and perform. And if we don't include a lot of practice with feedback, I would tell my clients, well, when I'm done with this instruction, 60% of it is going to be practice and feedback. We're going to have a little bit of information. We're going to demonstrate this is what we mean by all of that. And now you too, you demonstrate it back to us, and we'll give you feedback, and you'll do it again and again and again and get better and better and better. And now when you go back out to the job, you'll have some confidence in your own capability to go perform. And if you struggle with that transfer back out to the job, maybe you'll stick with it a little bit better. And of course, if we've got the supervisors and the peers looking at Guy's performance out there, maybe they'll be encouraging, and Guy will stick with it until he masters it. And that's what's difficult. So there's many aspects to doing good performance-based instruction or learning experiences. And because I don't think we can expect the individual contributors in the learning and development profession to figure this out on their own and to fight the forces that be and try to do it right. We need leadership to step up and put something in place and convince the clients to go along with this. And let's measure results instead of activities and see if this was worthwhile.
Yeah, again, quite a few very interesting points there. But the biggest was, of course, L&D practitioners themselves may not have so much in control because they're essentially kind of working in a system which is not in their control. It doesn't run the way they want or would like it to run. So it's the leadership team which has to really step up, own it, make changes, support whatever they have to. And there were, a couple of other things that I found very interesting. One was about training people about the job aids, because there's a common, if I can call misconception, there is a kind of a dichotomy that has been there in minds that either it is training or it is job aid. And many a times job aid is just kind of helping you to recall what you've done in training or helping you ensure that you do everything right. But sometimes, people may think that there is training and there is job aid, but job aid is really a great way to transfer what you were trained in a training program.
I agree. I like the term instruction, which to me is inclusive of job aids or performance support or whatever you want to call it, and training or education or communications. Instruction is there to instruct people on how to do the job. And too often we expect people to memorize everything, and they can't. It's impossible. So why are we continue trying to get everybody to memorize everything, all the little details, when we know that the forgetting curve is steeper than the learning curve? That's my joke. I don't know if that's really true. But one of the things that I've come to how to frame this in the last several years is, what does the performance context demand or allow? If the performance context demands a memorized performance response, then you better drill and practice over and over and over again and have spaced learning and practice and practice and practice. It's like a fire department. They practice all the time. Absolutely. They're in real fires, but then when there's not a real fire, they're practicing because they have to have this, their performance response has to be memorized on demand. And when the demand comes, they've got to respond. And there's no time to reference anything. But if the performance context allows for a reference response, we should default to, what Gilbert and Rumler back in the 60s and 70s called guidance, which later on became known as job aids, which later on became known as electronic performance support systems, which later on became known as quick reference guides, and now performance support or workflow learning where we're actually just referencing guidance of some sort. Now, either that guidance was built specifically for our performance situation and the specificity of our tasks and the environmental resources that we have to use, or if we grab a YouTube video that's kind of close and we can kind of look at that and figure it out. And so it's a combination of some formal stuff, some social learning, and a lot of trial and error. Or we have performance support that's specific for an individual's application. So if we had a job aid on active listening, but it didn't tell me how to do active listening when I'm in a sales situation or if I'm at the customer complaint window, because that's a different context, because people are angry and the other ones are, hey, they're interested in maybe buying something. But so there's a different context in how you handle that, and how you do your active listening is going to vary slightly based on that situation. So if we had active listening job aid for at the customer complaint window, it would be specific to the customer that's coming in with a complaint. And so how you treat that is a little bit differently. But too often our formal instruction, our formal training, our formal learning doesn't go that last mile to how to apply this in your situation. So most formal learning, from my experience, is a combination of formal learning and then good luck, you're on your own. You'll figure it out back on the job, informally or socially. But we didn't get them to do that. Now, jet airplane pilots, they learn how to actually fly the plane, land it, take off, do all the tricky maneuvers, all of that stuff. We don't leave any of that to chance because of the stakes. So sometimes we are addressing content that could have or should have been left to informal learning in the first place. They can learn it informally, they'll figure it out. They can learn it socially by asking their neighbor. But we tackle some of those things too often, I think, and there's no real value in it. We create throwaway content. No one's going to ever maintain that content over the life cycle. They're going to create it once and hope it's good forever. And then when it goes out of date, it's still out there because we weren't serious about what we were creating. We're not creating valuable assets. We're just creating some stuff that helps people, kind of. And it doesn't really take them all the way to their application. And it's but that's the trap that we're in. Sorry, that's another long answer.
That's fine. I think, and in fact, it kind of covered one of the other questions that I had for you around performance support and learning in the workflow, which is, of course, the shiny thing right now. But maybe there's a correlation in what you just said and what you said earlier. What you were saying is, in high stake environments like pilots, we're not leaving anything to chance. And in an organization for other stuff, we are treating everything at equal level. Even if some of it can be done informally, socially, we are investing time and efforts into that and also into anything that is more critical. So we're not differentiating between the stakes of different trainings that we create. So we are genericizing the level of stakes for all training. And also earlier you talked about just trying to give generic content for every training across audiences. So essentially, I don't know, maybe at a two-dimensional level, we are having a lot of generic content and a lot of generic level of stakes for all training. So everything is pretty similar, mediocre, and not really directed. So neither at a high stake level, nor personalized to the level of application that individual roles may need.
Yeah, I think that's an age-old issue. I left Motorola and joined a small consulting firm, and the head of that consulting firm had been working with Motorola on strategic planning for the training and development function. One of the things that this person, the late Ray Svensson, put in place at Motorola was what I call a governance and advisory system. So Motorola had 5 strategic business units that the organization was comprised of. And the top 1 or 2 person in each one of those business units sat on a governance board. And they made the financial allocations to projects, to an advisory group. So we had advisory groups for sales and marketing. We had an advisory group for manufacturing, materials, and purchasing, which is where I worked and supported. We had one for management, and we had another one for engineering. And Motorola was nothing if not engineering. And so those four major buckets, if you will, functionality, they were to make the decisions about what were their needs in the manufacturing materials and purchasing world. I mean, what were their key critical business issues, and where could training help support them? And they would make a request, and with a price tag to it, say, hey, to the governance board, to this top group, I want to do these 12 projects, and I need, $3.7 million to do them. And that group would look at all the requests on a semi-annual basis and decide, okay, we're going to give you this money, and we're going to give you this money, and we're going to give you this money. And oh, by the way, that third project on your list, you're not doing that one. Maybe we've got some secret thing going on in the background, and we're going to displace the need for that because we're going to abandon that product line, and we're going to put a new product line in. So we're not making any investments in some old stuff that's going to go away. Shh, can't tell anybody that. So these kinds of decisions were being made. So the top was governing the investments in learning. And so the advisory groups would conduct the projects and help assemble the teams, and we would do the projects for them. And we'd read out the results, and we'd be looking at the business measures and then using that to prove, some sort of a calculation for ROI. Not every leader is interested in ROI and everything. They just know it's the right thing to do. And the numbers may not show up for a quarter or two or a year or two. And so we're not going to worry about that. It's the right thing to do. People need to learn how to do this. They know that for a fact. And so they're not so concerned about it all the time. Other times they are. And so this takes away this thing where everything is equal. So we had Gary Rumler help us create an intake process for our design process at the training and development organization that we were. And so on the intake process, we were trying to pin down, so what's the reason for this request? What are the business metrics that we can look at to see if we have an improvement? So we began from the very beginning at looking at, what is it we're trying to affect from the business perspective, from the financial numbers, or productivity numbers that the business is already using. So where are we kind of focused on? And so then we could go in there and help the organization determine, you have a problem or an opportunity, and here's what's at the root of that. And oftentimes our projects in the analysis phase would show the client that training, instruction, knowledge, and skills has got nothing to do with your problem or opportunity. It's these other things. One, you don't have a process. That's why you got tremendous variation in your product, because you don't really have a process. You think you have a process, but you don't. We talk to your master performers, there's no process.
Right.
And so we would say you need to put in a process and stabilize it. And that may lead to things like Lean and Six Sigma and, putting in a reduced variation process. And maybe you don't need training, or maybe you do because you've changed the process significantly and now people need to learn the new process. But so first things first, put in the new process, build some software to support that process, train the people on how to use the software in the new process, boom, 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 and maybe that'll lead to improved business results. But it certainly doesn't lead with training and instruction. So we help clients begin to see that, it's not just all about knowledge and skills and learning and training. It's some of these other things too. So our initial projects were very critical in helping our stakeholders learn about what training can and cannot do, and what are some of the other variables of their process performance that they were wanting to focus on. And so this was an educational experience for everybody. And so, we helped do that and help them differentiate projects. We were able to reject projects because not everything is equal. And I think that that's something that's been going on in the learning and development profession, I think, for a long time, is that now we've got e-learning. Almost anybody can sit down and create it. Subject matter experts can create it. They may not know the performance, but they're not focused on performance anyway. They're focused on topics and not tasks. So we've kind of generalized everything and made everything equal, and every request for instruction or training or learning is of equal value. And that's just not true. I had a consulting firm where I had 25 employees, and lots of my employees wanted this and that, and these different things. And I couldn't afford it. I couldn't afford to meet their wants. I had to meet the needs of my business, and those needs of my business were driven by my customers, not by my staff. We were all there to serve the customer, not to serve ourselves. And I remember one person asking for a special kind of software. And I said, but our clients don't use that software. So if we create anything using that software, they can't do anything with it. So they don't want us to use that software. They want us to use this other software, which means we can hand off our deliverable to them and they can take and maintain it over time. And that person just didn't like it. Well, they're wrong because this is a better software. Well, so you have to take that business perspective. You've got to have that as an L&D practitioner. You need to have a sense of business and what you're trying to achieve for the customer, and use whatever is going to meet their needs in the short run, and the medium term, and the long term.
Yeah, you also touched on task versus topics, and I don't know if it was intended, but there was a correlation that came in, which was SMEs can create content and e-learning because they're always focused on topics, and that's easy, but that's really not what's going to deliver performance, right? And that's where we need to really focus on tasks. I have one specific question for you. You've been talking about, focusing on performance, but not on behaviors. And, in a chain of or a sequence, you would probably find behaviors as an intermediate to actual performance. Is there a difference here of understanding between the two terms?
Well, where I'm coming from on this is that Tom Gilbert, in his book, 1978 book, Human Competence, talked about the cult of behaviors. Mm-hmm. He was talking about was that he saw too often that people in the training business were focused on behaviors without understanding the context, without understanding the outputs of tasks. So behaviors are part of task performance, but sometimes you need to vary your behaviors depending on the situation and the output. If the building is on fire, you don't call a meeting and try to be collaborative about which escape routes to use. You command everybody to get out right now and let's not talk about it. But there's other times where you would be more collaborative. So there's nothing wrong with understanding the behaviors, but you've got to understand the behaviors within the broader context of there's a chain of tasks, there's lots of behaviors in that. If they're situationally appropriate behaviors, good. So you have to be able to read what is the situation and what am I trying to produce? Because no one is on the payroll to perform and employ behaviors or perform tasks. They're on the payroll to produce outputs, which are inputs downstream. And so that's my complaint about behaviors, because we too often talk about, well, our job is to change behaviors. Sometimes, yeah, maybe, but not always. Sometimes it's really to focus on the correct behavior, to vary that behavior in concert with producing an output that becomes a worthy input downstream.
So one, if it is mapped properly to the right output, then that sort of a behavior is probably something that you can still go for. But at the same time, let's be aware that there are situations where you need to be a little flexible. Flexible knowledge and skills are required to really modify your behavior to achieve the outputs.
Exactly.
Fantastic. Thanks for clarifying that. One final question, though you may have covered, but if there is anything that you would like to advise learning leaders and or learning designers on how they can bring performance focus, maybe one thing that they can do. Maybe we have done a lot of discussion on this already, but if you still find something interesting.
Well, I think that the leaders and their staff can collaborate to find an approach that they can adopt and adapt from. So the late Joe Harless had his approach, the late Bob Meager had his approach, Rumler and Gilbert, they had their approaches, I have my approach. There's many different approaches out there, and a lot of them are very good and they're worthy there. And the language we use is a little bit different, and sometimes it's for no other reason that we've been calling it something different forever. So I think that they really need to embrace a performance orientation. They need to go for learning in the workflow when that's appropriate through performance support and job aids and things like that. There's other times where there's a time and a place for learning so that it's committed to memory, or it's a honed skill that's available on demand when there's no time to reference things. And we need to employ some of the better practices that are in our field. They've been there forever. There's a rare, maybe it's not so rare, but a minority of people who are doing really, really good work and affecting performance. And there's a lot of us who are not doing it that well. We're generating a lot of content, and we're measuring content and engagement and all that. We're not looking beyond the activities of learning to the results of learning. And we need to start focusing on the terminal results and then assess whether or not the learning that we're doing is good enough because we're having that impact on the results of the business.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Guy, thank you so much. It's been such a enlightening discussion. There's a lot in this, and I'm sure I'll go back to this discussion and listen to it myself and make my notes out of it. But this has been really, really interesting. Thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. Thank you.